Welcome to the Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Join us as we continue the story of Where the Wind Takes You by LeRoy A. Peters.
Chapter 7. New Home and a New Family. After the battle with the vengeful bushwhackers, Jacques, Pierre, and Isaiah assessed the damage. "Well done, both of you," said Jacques. "I wish it didn't come to this," said Isaiah. "It was either us or them, mon ami," said Jacques. "Men like them are impossible to reason with." Isaiah nodded, then went to retrieve their horses. When he returned, he was horrified to find that the 3 bushwhackers had been scalped. Pierre was holding the scalp of the man that he killed and was offering Isaiah the scalp of his victim. Isaiah was about to decline it, but Jacques, who was tying his man's scalp to his belt, insisted he take it. "Mon ami, this is a part of being a mountain man." "How so?" asked Isaiah. "Among many other tribes, a warrior who takes the scalp of an enemy gains a lot of respect," said Jacques. "They call it médecine, and the warrior who collects the most scalps from an enemy is considered to have big médecine." Isaiah wasn't sure if he wanted that kind of respect. He understood what Jacques was telling him, but to mutilate another human being he found repulsive. "Think of it this way, Isaiah," said Pierre. "These bastards followed us all the way from St. Louis, so they could kill us. They would have done the same to us, if not worse." "My son speaks true," added Jacques. "These were not the innocent men, but scum of the higher order. Taking their scalps would and should not weigh heavy on your conscience." Isaiah thought it over for a moment. He didn't want to do anything that would make him uncomfortable, but he couldn't argue that these were bad men who were out to take his life and that of his friends. He reluctantly took the scalp of the man he shot from Pierre. "What do I do with it?" he asked. Father and son just laughed before they showed him. "Just tie it on your belt like this," said Pierre, "and the tribe will come across will consider you a warrior. Especially after they hear how you killed a man, a white man for that matter, that was trying to kill you and your friends." After he finished tying the scalp to his belt, Isaiah looked at the bodies. "Pity we don't have time to bury them." Jacques and Pierre just scoffed. "Vultures and buzzards have to eat too, mon ami," said Jacques, "just as much as the worms." They continued to travel north by northwest, following the Missouri River. They kept the 3 horses that belonged to the bushwhackers, hoping to trade them with the first friendly tribe they came across, or use them as pack animals to carry any meat from hunting. About 2 days after the battle with the bushwhackers, they came across their first herd of buffalo. Isaiah was awestruck as he sat on his horse and stared at the shaggy beasts. They were everything Jacques said they were. About 3 times the size of a horse, and with their curved horns, they were a fearsome sight. Jacques immediately called a halt, and announced that they would stay there for a day or 2. They were near what is now modern-day Omaha, Nebraska, the ancestral home of the Omaha tribe. After they set up camp, Jacques and Pierre took Isaiah hunting. "You are going to hunt and skin your first buffalo, mon ami," said Jacques. Isaiah was excited. He had hunted game growing up in South Carolina, and in the few months he lived in St. Louis, but nothing as big as buffalo. He followed Jacques and Pierre's lead as they showed him how it was done. They both brought down 2 buffalo cows with their rifles. Isaiah was amazed that the herd was not disturbed by the downed cows. When it was his turn, he shot a fat bull, hitting his mark in the lungs, bringing down the beast with no problem. "Magnifique, mon ami," said Jacques. "Now the hot pot comes, making meat." For the next couple of hours, the trio skinned and gutted the 3 downed buffalo. Pierre showed Isaiah the best parts to eat, which were the liver, hump, and tongue. Jacques removed the brains, explaining to Isaiah that they were for tanning the hides. It was at that moment Indians appeared over the horizon. Isaiah was the first to see them, and warned Jacques and Pierre. From a distance, Jacques could tell which tribe they were by the clothes they wore and hairstyle. "Omaha," he said. "They are friendly, but keep your wits up." Using sign language, he invited them in. It turned out that this was a hunting party, and Jacques offered to share some of the meat with them. The leader, whose name was Big Eagle, graciously accepted, and after they shared the meat, he smoked the peace pipe with the trio. Isaiah paid much attention to his surroundings and quickly noticed that some of the warriors were staring at his belt. Big Eagle signed to Jacques, asking about the scalp that was tied to Isaiah's belt. Jacques translated for Isaiah and told Big Eagle about the battle with the bushwhackers who were trying to kill them. At that moment, he and Pierre showed the scalps of the bushwhackers they killed, and Big Eagle and his warriors were impressed. After they finished smoking the peace pipe, the Omaha hunting party packed up and went back to their village, while the trio went back to their camp to cook their dinner and tuck in for the night. The next morning, Isaiah woke up to check on the horses and realized there were 3 new horses in their herd. He woke up Jacques and Pierre to show them. After examining the new horses, father and son both smiled. Jacques pointed to a painted eagle on each one of the horses. "These were from Big Eagle himself," he said. "They are a gift." "Why would he do that?" asked Isaiah. "Because we invited him in and shared our meat with him and his warriors," said Pierre. "He was obviously grateful for our kindness to him and his men, and he felt obligated to leave us these gifts." Isaiah understood and was learning fast about how he should act with Indians, and he was grateful to both Jacques and Pierre for the helpful lessons. The next few weeks were the same, uneventful until they hit the Rockies. Jacques advised to avoid contact with other humans, both red and white, for the time being, because they were passing territories of the Arapaho and Cheyenne, as they continued west and then north, traveling the border of what is now western South Dakota and eastern Wyoming. By the time they reached what is now southwestern Montana, Jacques and Pierre knew that they were almost home, but they were in the ancestral territory of the Cheyenne, who were enemies to the Assiniboine. Isaiah noticed that the two had been quiet for the past couple of days. Even Jacques wasn't in his usual jovial mood. However, following their lead, the youth kept quiet and was aware of his surroundings. He was still awestruck at the sight of the Rocky Mountains. Sometimes called the Shining Mountains by the trappers, they were everything Jacques had described. The Frenchman slightly turned and looked over his shoulder to see the look of awe in the youth before returning forward. He smiled to himself, reminiscing how he was when he first came to the mountains all those many years ago. Pierre was just anxious to get back home, for the Assiniboines tribe territory was farther north past the Big Sheep Mountains, and farther west to the Little Rocky Mountains, in what is now north-central Montana. Unlike most tribes of the northern plains and Rockies, the Assiniboine tribe were semi-nomadic, but like the other tribes, they followed the buffalo. Jacques Ledoux wasn't the only fur trapper to have lived and traded with the tribe, for they had been involved in the fur trade for the white man since the 1690s, mostly with trappers and traders from Canada, such as the Hudson Bay Company and their competition, the Northwest Company. Ledoux, who was a free trapper, or in French a voyager, did not trade his plumes with either company, but instead would travel the long trek to St. Louis to sell his plumes there. It was a riskier way of making a living, but for him the rewards were great. As he explained to Isaiah, money was useless in the wilderness, but he did manage to set aside some of his bank account in St. Louis for his children's future. A man can never know when his children will depend on it. As they continued, they came across a Cheyenne war party returning from a raid. The trio managed to stay silent and hidden, as they did not want to get into a confrontation if they could avoid it. After avoiding that potential disaster, they managed to reach the foothills of the Big Sheep Mountains a few days later. As they were passing through, they found who they were looking for. Jacques called a halt as he spotted a hunting party of 6, carrying a quarter of a moose. By the way they were dressed, he knew they were Assiniboine. "Greetings, my brothers!" he shouted in Assiniboine from a distance. When he clearly got their attention, he signaled Pierre and Isaiah to follow as they rode out to greet them. Isaiah was nervous. "Who are they?" "They are Assiniboine, my mother's people," answered Pierre. "Whether they are from our village or not, I do not know." As they approached the hunting party, Jacques and Pierre immediately recognized some of the men. "Wolf's Paw!" shouted a happy Jacques in Assiniboine. "Is it really you, my friend?" The leader of the hunting party, whose name was Wolf's Paw, immediately recognized the Frenchman and smiled. "It is good to see you again, Jacques," he said in Assiniboine. And how are you, Pierre?
Grateful to be home, uncle, answered Pierre in Assiniboine. How have you been, Stalking Bear?
The young warrior who rode beside Wolf's Paw, called Stalking Bear, was Wolf Paw's son. He was the same age as Pierre, and they had been childhood friends since birth.
I am well, brother, he said. Then he and his father noticed Isaiah.
Who was your friend? Asked Wolf Paw.
Jacques signaled Isaiah to come up so he could introduce him. My brothers, allow me to introduce you to Monsieur Isaiah Reinhardt. Nearly all the members of the hunting party had a hard time pronouncing Isaiah's full name. Wolf's Paw just shook his head and said,
You white men have very strange names.
The Frenchman and his son laughed, for they didn't disagree with the Assiniboine warrior.
But if he is a friend of yours, then he is a friend of ours.
At that moment, Jacques introduced Wolf's Paw and his party to Isaiah. Isaiah, who had been learning some sign language over the past weeks from Jacques and Pierre, gave the sign of peace and friendship to them. Wolf's Paw and Stalking Bear responded in kind and called Isaiah friend in the Assiniboine tongue. After Jacques translated, he informed Wolf's Paw that Isaiah was a great warrior. In the land of the whites, he saved Pierre's life and mine from being murdered. This brought excitement and smiles of gratitude on the faces of the hunting party. Pierre translated to Isaiah what his father had just said, and the youth was a little embarrassed.
This is good, said Stalking Bear. He must tell us his story when we return to the village. Cypher's bird woman will be pleased to hear it, said Wolf's Paw with a smirk.
And how is my lovely wife and little girls? Asked Jacques.
Waiting for your return, said Wolf's Paw.
Then let's not keep them waiting, said Pierre. After Isaiah had been introduced to the rest of the hunting party, they headed back to the Assiniboine village of Chief Yellow Wolf. Pierre was happy to get back home and be reunited with his mother and sisters, but he was anxious to see Shooting Star Woman again. Isaiah wasn't as nervous as before, now that Jacques' jovial mood had returned, but he was still nervous. They arrived at the village a half-hour later, and everyone was up in arms with excitement at the return of Jacques Ledoux and his son, Pierre. Everyone was also curious about the new stranger that arrived with them. Jacques and Pierre handed the reins of their horses to Isaiah when they went to pay their respects to Chief Yellow Wolf. Chief Yellow Wolf was in his 50s. He was about Jacques' height, with more of a stocky build. His eyes were not dim, and he had the look and vitality of a much younger man. He smiled at the Frenchman as the latter greeted him, and they embraced each other's arms, according to custom.
Welcome home, Jacques,
said Chief Yellow Wolf.
It is good to be home, responded Jacques.
Yellow Wolf turned his attention to Pierre and repeated the same embrace as he greeted him.
My daughter will be pleased that you have returned with your father, Pierre, said Chief Yellow Wolf.
Pierre was grinning from ear to ear as he temporarily looked past the chief and saw a Shooting Star Woman smiling back at him. It is great to be home, uncle, he said. There is something I wish to discuss with you later. Chief Yellow Wolf sensed what it was, but he just nodded. At that moment, a woman who appeared to be in her mid to late 30s was coming through the crowd, followed by 2 teenage girls. All 3 were smiling as the crowd made way for them to get through. Jacques softly called out Cypher's bird woman's name as he ran to her with open arms and gave her a long, passionate kiss. When he was done, he said in the Assiniboine tongue, I have waited a long time for that. You're not the only one, my love, responded Cypher's bird woman in French. Jacques released his wife for a moment so he could hug his daughters. Ah, my Lisette and Marie, he said. Did you miss Papa and Big Brother, eh? Oui, shouted both girls as they hugged their father. Lisette was 13 years old and Marie had just turned 12. Pierre had approached and given his mother a hug, before giving his little sisters a huge bear hug each. Isaiah could tell that the girls were Jacques' daughters, for they looked more like him, despite that they could both pass for full-blooded Assiniboines. After seeing their mother, it was clear that Pierre looked like her. Chief Yellow Wolf, said Jacques, my family, there is someone I wish for you and everyone here to meet. Jacques signaled Isaiah to approach, and he quickly introduced him to Chief Yellow Wolf, Cypher's bird woman, and the girls. Isaiah gave the universal sign language for friend to the chief, and gave Cypher's bird woman and the girls an exaggerated bow.
Welcome to my village,
signed Chief Yellow Wolf.
Any friend of Jacques Ledoux is a friend of my people.
He is more than just a friend, Chief LeRoy, said Pierre in Assiniboine. He saved our lives in the land of the whites.
He did he?
Jacques approached Isaiah and asked him to tell everyone about the incident at Emmett Barnes' Tavern in St. Louis. Don't worry, mon ami, said Jacques. I will translate. Isaiah told his side of the story of the incident, without embellishment. Jacques translated word for word. Everyone gasped and nodded and developed a respect for the newcomer. Cypher's birdwoman approached Isaiah. Thank you, she said in a heavily accented English. I am forever in your debt for saving the life of my husband and son.
It was nothing, madam, said Isaiah.
Nothing, explained Jacques. If it wasn't for you, my wife would be a widow and without a son, mon ami. The youth just humbly lowered his head, trying to hide his bashfulness.
We should hold a feast in his honor,
said Chief Yellow Wolf. The whole village whooped and hollered in agreement. Since Jacques Ledoux was Assiniboine by marriage and adoption, and his son was Assiniboine by blood, Isaiah saving their lives was a big thing to the people. Isaiah leaned over to Jacques and said, I am not sure I deserve all this attention. No one deserves more, mon ami, responded Jacques. Oh, and one more thing. How do you feel about getting married? A what? Chapter 8. Running Moon. Isaiah Reinhardt wasn't sure if he had heard correctly what his friend just asked him.
What do you mean about getting married?
He asked. Jacques just grinned. I will explain later, he said. You can take the horses over to the herd after you've unsaddled them. Isaiah did as he was told, but he filed what Jacques said in the back of his head. Pierre and his sisters volunteered to help him with the horses and supplies. After they dropped off the supplies at their lodge, they took the animals to the herd. As they were walking through the village, Isaiah noticed that he was the center of attention, because a lot of the village children were following and pointing at him. One brave little girl walked up to him and was asking him a question, but because he did not speak Assiniboine, he could not understand her. She is asking if she can touch your hair, translated Pierre. She has never seen anyone with hair the color of the sun. Isaiah smiled and obliged the little girl, who appeared to be no older than 6 or 7 years old. After she pulled on it a little, she giggled and ran back to her parents. Some other children followed her lead and asked to touch the yellow hair of the newcomer, reminding him of his 2 younger brothers, Micah and Manoah. Isaiah tried to oblige all the children as much as he could. Those who were able to touch his blonde hair laughed and giggled and ran back to their families to probably tell how his hair felt. You are the first yellow-haired white man we have seen, said Lizette. Isaiah was surprised that she spoke English, but then again, her father and brother spoke English as well, so he assumed that she learned it from them.
Do you get a lot of white visitors in your village? He asked.
Not a lot, said Marie. Papa is the only white man we know that has lived among our people off and on between trapping seasons.
Interesting, Isaiah thought. Most of the tapers, other than our father,
added Pierre. They just come and go, but our people have traded with them for years.
Any other tribes trade with the trappers? Said Isaiah.
Our enemies, the Blackfeet, are known to trade with trappers from the Hudson Bay Company, answered Pierre, while our people have mostly traded with the Northwest Fur Company.
And your father? Asked Isaiah. Does he trap for any of those companies?
The Ledoux children shook their heads. He is a voyage, or coureur de bois, said Pierre. He is a free trapper who works for no company but himself, and he trades with Yellow Wolf.
I remember him saying that being a free trapper was the best way to make a living, said Isaiah.
Compared to working slave wages for blood-sucking leeches like the Hudson Bay, oui, said Pierre.
In that case, said Isaiah, the laugh of a free trapper is a laugh for me.
Later that evening, Chief Yellow Wolf held a feast in Isaiah's honor. The youth was asked again and again to retell his side of the story of how he saved Jacques and Pierre's life back in St. Louis, and how he fought by their side against the 3 bushwhackers who followed them all the way out onto the prairie. With Pierre translating from English to Assiniboine, Isaiah told the 2 stories over and over again. Jacques tried to get him to embellish it more, for Indians loved a good story. However, Isaiah never considered himself a good storyteller, but he did his best and even showed the scalp of one of the bushwhackers that hung from his belt. The village whooped and cheered in respect for this brave, yellow-haired white man. While dinner was being served, Chief Yellow Wolf, who sat across from Jacques and his family, struck up a conversation with the Frenchman. "When will you be leaving for the beaver hunting grounds?"
"Maybe not for another couple of moons," answered Jacques in Assiniboine.
"Some warriors from another village paid us a visit a few moons ago," said Chief Yellow Wolf. "They heard that a group of white men were passing through the land of our enemies, the Crow and the Blackfeet heading east."
"I think I know who the leaders of this group are," said Jacques. "If Charbonneau is with them, and those men are explorers from the east, just passing through."
"The men who told us about them managed to capture some horses from this group," said Chief Yellow Wolf. "Will these white men be any trouble for us?"
Jacques just shrugged. "You'll never know," he said, "especially with that idiot Charbonneau with them as a guide."
The chief snickered.
Everyone knows that Jacques Ledoux did not like Toussaint Charbonneau. However, no one bothered to ask him why. If the group of white men that the chief was talking about had happened to be with the Corps Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, then that meant they were probably not far from St. Louis by now. Isaiah had paid little attention to the conversation since it was in Assiniboine, but he had hoped that Jacques would stay long enough so he could learn how to speak the language. Due to his German-Irish parentage, the youth could speak fluent German and passable Gaelic. Learning a new language has always interested him, but he never had the opportunity to learn any others than his father's and mother's native languages.
"Jacques," said Isaiah, "how long are we staying here among Chief Yellow Wolf's people?"
"At most 2 months," said Jacques. "Why?"
"No reason," said Isaiah. "Well, I would like to learn the Assiniboine language, so I can communicate without a translator."
"Magnifique," smiled the Frenchman. "I know a good way you can achieve that goal, mon ami."
"You do? How?"
Jacques had a wicked grin and instructed Pierre to translate for Isaiah. "Chief Yellow Wolf, my yellow-haired friend here is in need of a wife." After Pierre translated his father's statement, Isaiah nearly jumped up to object, but Pierre immediately pulled him back down, clamping a hand over his mouth, telling him to remain quiet. Jacques continued. "As you know, he is a good man who has done everything that has been asked of him without complaint."
"This is good," said Chief Yellow Wolf.
Wolfspaw stood and asked,
"How old is Yellowhair?"
Jacques translated the question to Isaiah, who was in a state of shock at the turn of events. It took him a minute to get himself together before answering the question.
I am 16 years old," he said.
Jacques translated the answer and Wolfspaw nodded.
"My daughter, Running Moon, has just come into her 16th summer," said Wolfspaw. "She is at the age to take a husband."
"Yellowhair will give you 3 horses for her hand," says Jacques.
Wolfspaw accepted.
Isaiah was beyond baffled after Pierre just translated at what had just transpired.
"Wait a minute," said Isaiah. "I don't have 3 horses."
"Of course you do, mon ami," said Jacques. "Those 3 extra horses we took from the damn bushwhackers."
"But those belong to you and Pierre," said Isaiah.
"Consider it as a token of appreciation for my thanks for saving our lives."
Isaiah stood there, dumbfounded. "But I don't know if I am ready to get married."
"You were going to ask that sweetheart of yours to marry you back in South Carolina," said Jacques, "before she decided to get knocked up by your brother."
"That's different," said Isaiah. "I was courting her for over a year. How can I get married to a woman that I haven't even met yet?"
"Touché," said Pierre. "But don't expect us to ask Wolfspaw."
"Why?" asked Isaiah.
"He is very sensitive when it comes to his daughter," answered Pierre.
The youth gulped. After Jacques had Isaiah retrieve the horses and present them to Wolfspaw, the Assiniboine elder inspected the animals and was satisfied. He had Isaiah follow him to his lodge so he could meet Running Moon. Jacques, Cypher's birdwoman, and their children followed as well. When they got to Wolfspaw's lodge, his wife was standing outside, just finishing up some chores. Their son, Stalking Bear, had informed her of the situation, so she was not surprised. With a simple nod from her husband, she went inside and was back out in less than a minute with Running Moon. As soon as Isaiah saw her, he was impressed and nervous at the same time. She was of average height, not supremely beautiful, but far from plain. She had curves in all the right places, and for her age she was voluptuous, more so than Annabelle. She had a round moon face and a small nose. Her hair was braided in 2, and she wore a white doe-skin dress, which was heavily decorated with beads from top to bottom, and the shoulders of the dress were decorated with mink on both sides. Isaiah couldn't help but smile at her, while deep down inside he was terrified as a doomed prisoner about to be sent to the gallows. Wolf's Paw presented Running Moon to Isaiah, who just found out that his new name was Yellowhair. Running Moon's head was bowed, but her father encouraged her to raise it so she could see the man she was marrying. Isaiah continued to smile and gave a slight bow. Running Moon smiled and almost giggled, but caught herself. Wolf's Paw said something to Jacques, and the Frenchman nodded.
He said your lodge is already prepared, said Jacques. You may take your bride.
What, just like that? Asked a still dumbfounded Isaiah.
Oui,
said Jacques, matter-of-factly. What about the ceremony, exchange of vows and all that? Jacques and his whole family just left.
This is in South Carolina, mon ami, he said, and these are not white people. It is a completely different custom. Now shoo.
Before he knew it, Isaiah was standing alone with his new bride. She pointed to a teepee that had been erected not far from her parents. Not wanting to look like a complete idiot, he gently took her hand, and they walked together towards their new lodge. After they both entered, there was a small fire that had already been prepared, along with buffalo robes and some food. Isaiah did not know what to do. The previous April, he had left his home and family after being betrayed by his brother and sweetheart. Now, it was in the middle of August, and here he stood, a married man to an Indian woman. At that moment, he felt the touch from Running Moon's hand. He looked into her eyes, and he saw something. Was it love? Maybe. Maybe not. But it was something he had not felt for a long time. Running Moon, he said to her. I'm not experienced in this. Isaiah stopped for a moment and realized that she probably didn't understand him. He was almost embarrassed, but he decided to take a gamble. Hell, I'm just going to kiss you and take it from there. Kiss her he did. It was a gentle kiss, and after it was over, Running Moon smiled. She had never been kissed like that before. To her, it felt like a bear getting its first taste of honey. She wanted more, and she let him know it. Isaiah began to feel something stir in his loins. Even though he was a virgin, his instincts began to kick in. He gently pulled himself from the embrace for a moment, and with a smile, he pointed to the buffalo robes. Running Moon smiled back and nodded. She immediately pulled her dress from over her body and gently placed it by the buffalo robes. Isaiah was just about to get off his trousers when he saw her naked for the first time. He just gawked as his blood had risen 100-fold. He suddenly felt his manhood bulging through his pants, and he was almost embarrassed at first. But Running Moon was giggling, excited and pleased that she had that kind of effect on him. She approached him as her breasts, which were bigger than he thought, swayed up and down. She stood on her toes to kiss him. This time her arms wrapped around his neck. Isaiah gently wrapped his arms around her waist, his hands landing on her buttocks. Feeling his manhood grow bigger through his pants, Running Moon paused, released herself from his embrace, and helped him out of his clothes. Within seconds, Isaiah was as naked as a newborn baby. Running Moon was giggling again, because she had never seen a man as white as Isaiah. Isaiah didn't seem to mind. In fact, he liked her laugh, and even chuckled to himself as she touched his skin and used sign language, saying that he was white as snow. Then her eyes fell on his manhood, which was at full attention, while his eyes for the moment were on her body, mostly her breasts. She gently took his hand and placed it on one of her supple mounds. She moaned after he gave a gentle squeeze. This was the first time he had touched another woman's body, and he was loving it. After seeing his father carry his mother up the stairs of their house on many occasions, Isaiah released Running Moon's breast and picked her up in his arms. She wasn't sure what he was doing, but instinct told her to trust him. It became clear to her when she realized that he was carrying her to their bed, and he gently lay her down on the robes. He kissed her again, and she returned that kiss. With her arms around his neck, they were intertwined. With one free arm, she guided him into her, and at that moment they both suddenly moaned at the same time. They made love all night long, each love-making better than the last. By a few hours after midnight, they were sound asleep. When morning came, Running Moon got dressed and made breakfast for her new man. Isaiah, who had learned some sign language from Jacques and Pierre, managed to communicate some with her. After they were done eating, he told her his name, his real name, Isaiah, he said, pointing to himself. He repeated the process until she understood.
Isaiah, she said.
Isaiah just chuckled at her pronunciation of his name. But the more they managed to communicate, the more he liked her. Some of the things inside the lodge he was telling her what he called them in English. In return, she would tell him what they were called in Assiniboine. After the morning language session, they got naked again and returned to the ropes for some more lovemaking. As they lay together that morning, Isaiah thought about his life so far. Back in April, he was just betrayed by two people he loved and on the verge of committing murder. And now here he was lying next to a beautiful Indian woman, happily married in the middle of the mountains. As he held her in his arms, Isaiah thought, "Is this what love is like? Is it even that?" He remembered how Philip and Annabelle betrayed him. He thought he loved Annabelle and was going to marry her. Hell, he wanted to marry her, but fate and circumstances had other plans. Now he had a wife. His wife. Yes, she was Indian, but he didn't care. He found himself actually liking her. The question was, did she feel the same way about him? Running Moon opened her eyes and looked up at her new man. Just the day before, she was a maiden. Now she was a married woman, to a white man no less. So far, she liked what she saw and what she felt. She began to wonder if he felt the same way. Isaiah, as if reading her thoughts, looked at her and gently stroked her cheek. She smiled at him, and he returned that smile. Suddenly, the memory of Annabelle was gone. So was Philip, the rest of his family, and South Carolina. Isaiah stared deeply into the eyes of his new bride, and at that moment, he decided that he was going to love her as a husband should. He would not betray that love as it was done to him. He sensed that she felt the same way. "I am yours, Running Moon," he said in sign language. "Now and forever, for as long as you will have me." Running Moon realized that he meant what he said, and she responded, "I am yours, Yellow Hair, now and forever, for as long as you will have me." With that, he smiled and kissed her. Before they knew it, they were making love again, and it was almost noon.
Chapter 9. Life is Good. For the next 2 months, the Assiniboine village of Yellow Wolf was extremely busy. Pierre had asked the chief for permission for Shooting Star Woman's hand in marriage. Chief Yellow Wolf gave his permission and demanded 3 horses from the son of Jacques Ledoux. Pierre was more than willing to go on a horse raiding expedition against either the Blackfeet, Crow, or the Sioux. His father suggested instead on giving the chief the 3 Omaha horses as a bride price. Why risk your life on a horse raiding expedition if you don't have to? Pierre thought it over and believed that his father's advice was sound. Despite that fact, Pierre wanted to prove to himself and his future father-in-law that he was an Assiniboine warrior through and through. He accepted the horses from his father to give to Chief Yellow Wolf. A couple of days later, he and Shooting Star Woman were married. Life was going well for Isaiah. He and Running Moon were both settling into married life. With her help and the help of Jacques, Cypher's bird woman, and their daughters, he was learning the Assiniboine language very quickly, and in return, he was teaching Running Moon how to speak English. He was very impressed with how quickly she was picking it up, better than he was learning her language. During their private moments, they both made it a little game that she would often tease him every time she would ask what the English words for certain body parts were, and she would point to intimate areas, which often led to fun under the buffalo robes. At first, Isaiah wasn't sure if he loved Running Moon, mainly because he still had feelings for Annabelle. However, Running Moon continued to help him get over the pain of their betrayal. For the first time since he left South Carolina, Isaiah was no longer bitter or angry, at least at them, but he would be satisfied and content if he never saw them again. Running Moon had played a big part in that, but so had Jacques Ledoux, his family, and the village of Chief Yellow Wolf. Even though the fall trapping season was still a month or 2 away, Isaiah Reinhardt's lessons began. Jacques and Pierre would take him down to the Yellowstone River, which ran through the Big Sheep Mountains. They taught him how to look for beaver signs as well as danger. "Mon ami," said Jacques, "one of the most important lessons a child must learn in practice is always being aware of your surroundings. There are many dangers from animals, both 4-legged and 2-legged, if you catch my meaning." Isaiah nodded. Jacques and Pierre brought out their beaver traps, and then showed the greenhorn how trapping beaver was done. Pierre took one of the traps and walked out knee-deep in water, and then set the trap not far from a beaver lodge. Isaiah, who followed him, paid strict attention and filed every move that Pierre made in the back of his head. After the trap was set, Pierre had Isaiah find a branch that was at least a foot long.
The greenhorn managed to chop one off a small tree, with leaves still attached to it. Pierre was satisfied and took out a small bottle. He opened it and gave it to Isaiah to smell. When the youth did, the smell almost knocked him back. Jacques was laughing from the bank after seeing Isaiah's reaction, while Pierre gave a good chuckle. "What the hell is that?" asked Isaiah. "We call it beaver medicine," answered Pierre. "Smells more like beaver crap than medicine," said Isaiah. Pierre guffawed. "Well, it does come from the scent glands of the male beaver." "What is it used for?" asked Isaiah. "Beavers are territorial creatures," said Pierre. "I hammer down the branch right next to the trap and pour the medicine on the branch to attract the beaver." Isaiah understood immediately. "I get it. Once a beaver comes to investigate, thinking another beaver has encroached on his territory, he will smell and touch the medicine-laced branch, stepping into the trap in the process." "Voila," said Pierre. "You are a fast learner, mon ami." After they set that trap, they returned to the bank, where Jacques was keeping a lookout. They moved farther down the riverbank and managed to find more beaver lodges. This time, Jacques went into the river and had Isaiah follow him and show him what he learned from Pierre by having him set the trap. Pierre stood on the bank this time to keep a lookout for danger. Isaiah remembered the lesson and repeated everything that Pierre taught him. He first got a foot-long branch and attached it to the beaver trap before hammering it down and setting the trap. When that was all said and done, he poured the beaver medicine on the branch, with Jacques looking on. When he was done, Jacques inspected and was satisfied. "Magnifique," he said. "You have the makings of a true mountain man." Isaiah was proud of his accomplishment. Jacques and Pierre advised that a seasoned trapper checks his traps at least 2 times a day. Isaiah promised to do that at least 3 times a day, which he did. The trio spent the rest of the day setting traps up and down the riverbank before returning to the village. The next morning, they found all their traps filled with beaver, much to Isaiah's excitement. They returned to the village with their prize and had their women skin and prepare the pelts. The beaver fur was just starting to grow thick for the winter. However, Jacques informed Isaiah that they could still get a good price for the pelts in St. Louis. "You did well today, yellow hair," said Jacques in Assiniboine, calling Isaiah by his Assiniboine name. The youth was catching on quickly. "Thank you." "The people need meat," said Jacques. "I have spoken with Beaufort and Stalking Bear, and they have invited us to go hunting with them." Isaiah smiled. "I will be honored to hunt with and for the people," he said in Assiniboine. "Your people need meat for the winter." "They are your people too, husband," said Running Moon in a heavily accented English. Everyone laughed. "She is right, mon ami," said Jacques in English. "The Assiniboine became your people the moment she became your wife." "I have you to thank for that," said Isaiah. "Any regrets?" asked Jacques. Isaiah looked at Running Moon as she continued to work on the pelt. She returned his gaze, and at that moment, Isaiah smiled as he looked into her beautiful black eyes. She returned his smile, deep down fully relieved, knowing that he truly cared for her. "I have no regrets." Later that night, after he and Running Moon made love, Isaiah was in deep thought. Life had taken a turn that he could never imagine, and it was great. He thanked God for it, but did he deserve it? It was the first week of April that he left his family and home with a broken heart. It was now almost the end of September, and here he was living in the Rocky Mountains, married and not yet even 17 years old. Life was good, but Isaiah still had questions. He missed his parents and his siblings, other than Philip, but he was content if he never saw them or even returned to South Carolina again. He had grown close to Jacques and Pierre and their families. The French trapper and his son had become more than just teachers and mentors to him. They treated him like family when they had no reason to, other than the fact that he did save their lives back in St. Louis. Then there was Running Moon. During the short time he knew her, he had grown very close to her, to the point that he felt maybe they belonged together. She brought him out of his reverie by pulling on his hair. He looked down at her and smiled as he gently stroked her cheek. "What are you thinking about, husband?" she asked in her Assiniboine tongue. Isaiah sighed before answering, "My home and my family." Running Moon had a slightly confused look on her face. "I mean, where I come from," Isaiah explained. "Where I was born." "You never told me about your family," she said. "You never asked." They both chuckled for a minute. Isaiah then told Running Moon about his family, where he came from, and why he left. He told her about Annabelle and Philip and how their betrayal hurt him, that he would have killed them if he stayed. He didn't want that on his conscience. Running Moon listened as he told her his life story in both English and Assiniboine.
Do you miss your family? She asked him.
I do, answered Isaiah, but I am happy here.
Do you miss Annabelle?
Isaiah thought for a moment and then smiled. I am no longer angry at her or my brother for that matter, he said, but I do not care if I never see them again.
Are you happy with me? Asked Running Moon.
I am very happy to be with you, said Isaiah, and I will be with you for as long as you wish to have me.
Then you will be with me forever, said Running Moon.
I think I would like that very much.
So will I,
giggled Running Moon as she suddenly pounced on Isaiah. As he was being straddled by this beautiful Indian woman, who was his wife, Isaiah thought that if his life was good, it had just gotten better. Chapter 10. Dangerous Creatures. It was the middle of October, and winter was right around the corner. In the Rocky Mountains, it would come early. The Ledoux and the Reinhardts helped with the winter hunt and moved the village to their winter encampment before heading south to the Bighorn Mountains for the winter trapping season. Isaiah had become an adept student in the trapping business, and after a few more lessons, he was trapping nearly as much beaver as Jacques and Pierre. The father and son duo were both impressed and proud of how far the young greenhorn had come in such a short time. Trapping wasn't the only thing Isaiah was excelling at. The language lessons between him and Running Moon never ceased, and he was getting better at learning the Assiniboine language more and more. Running Moon, through sign language, was getting better at learning English. In fact, she was getting better at it than her husband was at Assiniboine. By his own admission, she spoke English better than he did. Pierre's wife, Shooting Star Woman, was interested in learning English as well as French, and the fact she had a willing teacher who spoke her language fluently and could teach her both of the foreign tongues made things very easy. One of the things that both Pierre and Isaiah found to be surprisingly easy and rewarding was marriage. Learning from their parents, especially their fathers, the newly married men were quickly learning on the go about being devoted and loving husbands. Jacques and Cypher's Birdwoman's marriage was unique in that. Unlike most marriages of the time, theirs was based on love and respect for each other. Most marriages, both white and non-white, were based on necessity. Love came later, or not at all. Isaiah understood this, but he didn't entirely agree with it. His own parents' marriage was based on love, which is why the betrayal by Annabelle with his brother hurt so much. While his love for Running Moon continued to grow, and Annabelle became a more distant memory, he prayed and hoped that they had the kind of marriage his parents and Jacques and Cypher's Birdwoman had. So far, he had no complaints. Other than trying to be a good husband, which Running Moon obviously had no complaints about either. Pierre was hoping the same thing for Shooting Star Woman. Even though he had known her all his life, he knew that he was not as experienced in marriage as his father. He wanted to be the kind of man that his father was, both as a husband, friend, and hopefully soon as a father himself. Jacques Ledoux and Cypher's Birdwoman had a very strong, loving, and healthy marriage, even by the standards of the time. There were no secrets between them, and they were each devoted to raising their children. Now that the trapping season was on and the beaver pelts were coming in daily, Jacques, Pierre, Isaiah, and their families had to be on the lookout. They were in Crow Country, the enemy of the Assiniboine, but that was not the only problem. They had to be on the lookout for other trappers as well. Jacques told a story one time about how he and some of his fellow voyagers were robbed and left for dead by other trappers, men who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and their Blackfeet allies. It was Jacques' second year in the wilderness. When this happened, he was a lucky one because he was the only one who survived the attack. Had he not been hunting that day, he never would have managed to escape and his scalp would be hanging from a Blackfoot warrior's lodge. It was an Assiniboine hunting party led by a young yellow wolf that found the young French trapper almost starving, and they not only took him in, but helped get revenge against the Blackfeet and their Hudson Bay allies for their treachery. Since that day, Jacques had a strong distrust of other trappers, especially those who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. While he had no love for the Blackfeet, he felt they were at least honest, like most Indians that he knew, when it came to their feelings about someone or some people. Jacques would warn his son and Isaiah, "Be always on the lookout and never let your guard down. Your life and the lives of your loved ones depend on it." Early that morning, Isaiah and Pierre were just coming in from their trap lines. Between them, they had a total of 15 beavers. Jacques and Cypher's Birdwoman had just come in from a hunt with a yearling moose. As everyone was getting busy skinning and butchering the beaver and the moose for dinner, Jacques and Cypher's birdwoman both paused for a moment. Picking up on their cues that they were probably being watched, Isaiah and Pierre immediately grabbed their rifles, while Shooting Star Woman and Running Moon got their bows and arrows, and signaled Lisette and Marie toward one of the 3 lodges that they had set up. "Hello, the camp!" came a voice from the east of the campsite. "Permission to come in." By this time, Jacques had his Charlesville rifle at the ready. In Assiniboine, he told Cypher's birdwoman and the rest of the women to hide. When they were out of sight, Jacques responded to the voice. "Come in if you are friendly." Out of the forest, 3 white men rode in. They had their rifles in a non-threatening position as they rode. Isaiah noticed at least 20 traps among their pack horses. He concluded that they were trappers, however. Neither he nor Pierre lowered their guard as the 2, along with Jacques, had their rifles in a ready-to-shoot position. "We come in peace," said a light-haired man who appeared to be the leader. "The name is Coulter, John Coulter, and we mean you gentlemen no harm." Isaiah slightly turned to Jacques, who signaled him and Pierre to lower their weapons. "You and your friends come on down," said Jacques. "We were just about to butcher a moose and some beaver." "We noticed," said John Coulter. The name sounded familiar to Jacques, but he filed it in the back of his head and he called out the women that all was well. Cypher's birdwoman, Shooting Star Woman, Running Moon, Lisette, and Marie cautiously came out of the lodge. Jacques again assured them that all was well, and when they were convinced, they returned to butchering the moose, while Pierre and Isaiah volunteered to help with the beaver catch. Jacques invited John Coulter and his 2 friends to sit by the fire and have some coffee, which the newcomers graciously accepted. "I didn't catch your name, friend," said Coulter. "Jacques Ledoux, formerly at Paris." "These 2 here gentlemen with me is Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon," said Coulter as he introduced his 2 friends. Hancock and Dixon bowed their heads to Jacques as they helped themselves to coffee. Jacques never lowered his guard. He still had his rifle in his lap, just in case, but he was cordial. John Coulter noticed this and understood the Frenchman's distrust. "Who are your friends?" he asked. "Allow me to introduce you to my family," said Jacques. The Frenchman called everyone as he introduced them to the newcomers. "My wife, Cypher's birdwoman, and our son Pierre and daughters, Lisette and Marie," he said. "And this young man is our mon ami, Isaiah Reinhardt, his wife, Running Moon, and our daughter-in-law, Shooting Star Woman." "Pleasure to meet all of you," said Coulter. Dixon was smiling at Running Moon and Shooting Star Woman. "Nice looking squad you got there," he said. In a split second, Dixon was looking down the barrels of Isaiah's pistols and Pierre's rifle. Jacques had his rifle ready to shoot. "That's our wives you talking about, jackass," said Isaiah. The tone of his voice was low but hard, and the look in his eyes said it all. Jacques and Pierre were ready to shoot. All Dixon had to do was cough. Coulter gently took control of the situation. "Take it easy now," he said. "My friend here meant no offense. He is new to these mountains." "I am sorry," said an extremely nervous Dixon. I didn't mean to offend your women. It's just that where we come from they call Injun women squaws." Jacques lowered his rifle. "Monsieur Dixon," he said, "when white people call Indian women that, do you actually think they mean it as a compliment?" Dixon had to force himself to think when Pierre and Isaiah still had guns on him. "I can answer that question," said Forrest Hancock, who didn't move a muscle during the entire standoff. "I was asking him," said Jacques. No, I don't think they do." Dixon finally answered. "Please, I swear, I'm truly sorry if I offended your women." Pierre lowered his rifle after Shooting Star Woman gently touched his shoulder and whispered in his ear. Isaiah wasn't convinced and still had his pistols on Dixon until Running Moon gently put her hand on his arm to lower his weapons. The look in her eyes said it all, and he put his pistols back in his belt and returned to his work. The women did the same, while Jacques, joined by Pierre, continued to chat with Coulter. Hancock and Dixon thought it was wise to keep their mouths shut and let their leader do the talking. "Now that we have all calmed down," said Jacques, "what brings you 3 to the mountains?" "Well, Jacques," said John Coulter, "I was on my way back to St. Louis with Captain Lewis and Clark when I ran into these 2 back in August." At the mention of Lewis and Clark, Jacques now understood why he had heard the name Coulter before. "I thought your name sounded familiar," he said. "So you were with the Corps Discovery, along with that idiot Charbonneau, eh?" For the first time, Coulter smiled. "Yep and yep," he said. "Yep, I was with the Corps and Discovery, and yep, Charbonneau is an idiot." Jacques and Pierre laughed.
I often wondered how any of you survived with him as your guide, said Pierre.
Credit goes for this woman, Sacagawea, said Coulter. Almost feel sorry for her being married to such an imbecile.
Oui, said Jacques. He is at the highest order.
I take it you two aren't exactly friends, said Coulter.
I would rather kiss a chiclesi than call Toussaint Charbonneau my friend, said Jacques as he spat into the fire. But they made it back to St. Louis, eh?
Far as I know, they have, said Coulter. If you don't mind me asking, what tribe is your wife's people?
Assiniboine.
Coulter just nodded and then turned to Isaiah, who had just finished skinning his second beaver. I noticed a southern accent and something else in your language, Mr. Reinhardt, he said. You're from the south? I am, said Isaiah as he looked up from his work. South Carolina, to be exact, of German-Irish parentage. That is one hell of a mixture, said Coulter. I am a Virginian man myself. As the conversation continued, Coulter announced that he and his two friends were going to winter with the Crows. Jacques nodded and wished them luck, and told them to be wary of the Blackfeet, explaining they come and go as they please, even though winter was just beginning. Coulter thanked him for the good wishes as well as the hospitality, but didn't want to overstay his welcome, especially after Dixon's big mouth almost got all three of them shot. When they left, Jacques followed them at a distance to make sure they left, before returning to the campsite. By evening, the moose was prepared and on a spit. Isaiah and Pierre decided to go out and check their traps. Jacques reminded them to be wary of their surroundings as they rode out. It was while they were returning to the campsite that their horses had gotten wind of something and were getting skittish. The very next second, a grizzly bear, fattening itself up for the winter, appeared out of a raspberry bush. The dreaded beast was the single most feared animal in the Rocky Mountains, responsible for more deaths of human beings and animal attacks than any other animal at the time. Called Old Ephraim by the trappers, the grizzly bear weighed up to 790 pounds and stood up to 7 feet at the shoulders while on all fours. This Bruin was no exception to its kind, as it immediately stood on its hind legs and roared. Isaiah's horse bucked in fright, knocking him to the ground, while it ran to God knew where. Pierre's horse, on the other hand, had encounters with grizzlies before, and remained calm as his rider kept it under control. Pierre, seeing Isaiah in danger, immediately took out his rifle and in a split second aimed and fired at the beast. The bullet found its mark as it pierced the grizzly's throat, but grizzly bears are notoriously hard to kill. While Pierre seriously wounded the beast, he also made it angry by 10 levels. The bear dropped on all fours and charged at Pierre, who kicked his horse into a gallop toward the river in the opposite direction from the campsite. Seeing the big beast chasing after his friend, Isaiah quickly got his wits together and aimed his rifle at the beast and fired, hitting the bear in the backside. Sensing the threat from behind, the grizzly did an about-face. Blood spurting from his throat, the beast was still in a rage as it charged for Isaiah. "Run, Isaiah!" shouted Pierre as he quickly reloaded his rifle. But Isaiah had nowhere to run to, except up the nearest tree, so up the tree he went as fast as he could. The grizzly missed his moccasined feet by an inch. The wounded beast roared at his quarry, blood still spurting out of his mouth and neck. Then Isaiah remembered his pistols. As he held onto the tree trunk while sitting on a limb, he managed to take out one of the pistols and pointed it directly into the bear's gaping mouth and fired. The bullets pierced through the back of the bear's throat, and in that split second, the beast fell backward, dead. Pierre slowly rode up to the Bruin and fired his rifle into its skull, just to make sure that it was dead. "All is well, mon ami," he said. "You can come down now." Isaiah slowly climbed down as Jacques and Running Moon rode up with his missing horse. "I can't seem to leave you two alone for 1 second," said Jacques in mock anger. "Ah, mon maître dîner." Running Moon ran to Isaiah, concerned for her husband's well-being. "You are hurt?" she asked in English. Isaiah shook his head. "Just a little shook," he responded in Assiniboine. Jacques patted his son on the back for saving Isaiah's life. "I didn't kill the beast, Papa," said Pierre. "I just put a bullet in him just to see if it was dead. Isaiah deserves the honor." "We both killed it," said Isaiah. "But your father is right, you did save my life in a way." "As you saved ours," smiled Jacques. "Magnifique," said Isaiah. "So now we're even." At that, the trio and Running Moon left.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stagecoach, brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence, where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue with the adventures of Isaiah Reinhardt in Where the Wind Takes You by LeRoy A. Peters.